Hello, this is Helen Dexter, course convener of PL7505 International Security, and these slides are a brief introduction to human security. So let's start by going back to one of the key questions that we set out in the first week's reading, one of the key questions at the heart of contemporary security studies. So what does it mean to be secure? And in terms of national security, in terms of a traditional way of thinking about security, that would mean having integrity of borders, independent control of territory, economic wealth, military power, and the preservation of vital interests. But what does it mean to make a human being secure then? If we were going to change our referent object from the state to the human being, what makes a human secure? This is a good starting question to think about on the forums. So we can think about human security then as another approach to security that developed after the end of the Cold War and in light of the shortcomings of the realist approach to security at the end of the Cold War. But rather than developing in academic discourse, human security developed in policy circles. So the seminal text spawned the widespread use of the term human security by governments, intergovernmental organisations, non-governmental organisations, and academics is the United Nations Human Development Programme report of 1994. So the Human Development Report sets human security out this way. It says human security can be said to have two main aspects. It means first, safety from such chronic threats as hunger, disease and repression, and second, it means protection from sudden and hurtful disruptions in the pattern of daily life, whether in homes, in jobs or in communities. And the Human Security Report lists 7 threats to human security. They are personal security, economic security, health security, political security, community security, food security, and environmental security. Human security is then very much about broadening security studies. So, although human security is now a very well-established term in security studies, you'll still find that there are different definitions of human security. And so when you're reading a piece of literature on human security, it's always worth stopping to ask, what does this particular author actually mean by human security? How do they define human security? And when you're making an argument of your own, it's worth pointing out what you actually mean by human security. And the debate within human security about how to define the concept really centres around whether human security should have a very broad definition or whether it should have a narrow definition. And I've picked 3 definitions here for you to think about and perhaps to debate on the forums. The first is from that 1994 UN document, and it defines human security. It says can be said to have 2 main aspects. It means first, safety from such chronic threats as hunger, disease and repression, and second, it means protection from sudden and hurtful disruptions in the pattern of daily life, whether in homes, jobs or communities. The Human Security Centre, however, defines human security as the protection of individuals and communities from war and other forms of violence. Now, you might say that that's a particularly narrow definition of human security because it focuses on violence and military threats. And then finally, Al-Kiri has a particularly broad definition of human security to protect the vital core of all human lives in ways that advance human freedom and human fulfillment. Now, you could think that that's quite a broad and perhaps vague definition of human security. Now, the holy grail of human security is supposed to be this idea of freedom from want, freedom from fear, and a life lived in dignity. But which should we prioritise out of these? And it's worth thinking about when you're looking at different definitions of human security, whether you think they're prioritising freedom from want or freedom from fear, and whether they include a life lived in dignity. So there are still competing definitions even within this very established notion of human security, and it's important to think through what the implications of these definitions are. So some questions to think about when you're looking at definitions of human security. Firstly, which definition do you think is most convincing and why? Do you think human security should have a broad or a narrow definition, and what are the implications of having such a broad definition of human security or a narrow definition? Why do you think a particular actor, a particular state or organisation would choose one definition over another? And linked to that, and possibly the most important question to think about, is what kind of actions or practices does a particular definition enable? So when looking at a definition of human security, it's worth asking what this definition makes possible. What kinds of actions are legitimated through this definition? Okay, so what might we say are the theoretical implications of human security? Well, in terms of the nature of the threat, it's no longer purely military threats that count as threats to security, but non-military as well. So we can see that human security fits within this broadening move within security studies. In terms of the referent object, it's no longer the state, but the human being. And for human security, the claim is that the referent object is all human beings, regardless of geographical location. So it's not just about protecting citizens of a particular state, but protecting all human beings. Now, this might be a claim that you think is problematic as you read and as you debate, but this is the claim of human security. In terms of agents of security, of who provides security, well, this is a shift perhaps just from the state alone to intergovernmental organisations to non-governmental organisations. So perhaps one of the implications of human security is that the state is no longer the sole provider of security, and also that agents of security perhaps need to be transnational as well. If the threat is global, then it requires a global response. Again, this is something that you might want to think about and debate. And in terms of the means of security, well, they could be fundamentally different from those of the state. So the emphasis again is on non-military means of security. Again, these implications I think are questionable, and there'll be things that we're going to debate as we go along. So, having said that there might be problems translating the theory of human security into policy, human security has actually been adopted by a number of states. In May 1998, Canada and Norway announced that human security was to be the leading principle in their foreign policy. So the question we asked previously is, how useful is human security for policymakers? Well, it's obviously useful for something. In 1999, a further 9 countries formed the Human Security Network. Members include Canada, Austria, Norway, Chile, Greece, Ireland, Jordan, Mali, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Switzerland and Thailand. And you can go to the Human Security Network website if you want to know more about this organisation. Japan in 1998 also adopted human security as a concept, but remains separate from the Human Security Network. So it's worth thinking about why a particular state would adopt human security. Again, this is something that I think would be interesting for you to debate in the forums, but it's worth looking at that list of members of the Human Security Network and thinking about what kind of states they are. To get you started, these are states that would be considered middle powers. So they're not big players in the international realm. So you want to think about what might be the motivations of middle powers adopting human security. And again, we need to come back to this idea of what does human security enable? What kind of practices does it make possible? And how would these states benefit, or why would they see it as a good thing to adopt human security as their foreign policy framework? Similarly, it's worth thinking about why certain states would be wary of human security, and which states you think they are. Okay, so I want us to take a look at the principles of the Human Security Network. And I've taken this from the Human Security Network website. And as we read this through, I want you to keep 2 critical questions in mind. So what claims are being made on behalf of human security in these principles, and what practices are enabled through these claims? So the following principles emerged from the first ministerial meeting of the Human Security Network in Norway, May the 20th, 1999. A commitment to human rights and humanitarian law is the foundation for building human security. Human security is advanced in every country by protecting and promoting human rights. the rule of law, democratic governance, and democratic structures, a culture of peace and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. The international organisations created by states to build a just and peaceful world order, above all the United Nations in its role to maintain international peace and security as stated in the Charter, must serve the security needs of people. Promoting sustainable human development through the alleviation of absolute poverty, providing basic social services for all, and pursuing the goals of people-centred development is necessary for building human security. Innovative international approaches will be needed to address the sources of insecurity, remedy the symptoms, and prevent the recurrence of threats which affect the daily lives of millions of people. So, what claims do we think are being made in this statement of principles on behalf of human security? Well, you can see that there's a strong relationship here between democracy and democratic states and security. So, according to these principles, secure states are democratic states, and that's something to bear in mind. I think there's also a relationship between human rights and security, and a relationship between development and security, and the alleviation of poverty and security. There's also claims here about having to prevent threats. So we might ask what the relationship is between human security in this context and intervention. There's a mention of innovative international approaches. Innovative is always a word that makes me nervous when we're thinking about international approaches. What does this mean in practice? It also places the United Nations and states as the central actors in security, as the providers of security. So think about what kinds of claims are being made here and what this discourse might enable, and we'll come back to this later on. So in the principles of the human security network, we see an implicit link between the secure state as a democratic state and a developed state, and poverty at the root of insecurity. And this brings us quite nicely onto the relationship between human security and development, and what's known as the security development nexus. So human security really is as much a part of development studies as it is security studies, and the human security concept developed alongside the human development concept. And with human security, we really see a merging of the two concepts of security and development. So the idea of the security development nexus really is recognising a relationship between military threats and non-military threats, or an interdependence with military threats and non-military threats. So the argument goes that conflict prevents development, but at the same time, underdevelopment exacerbates or even causes conflict. So on the face of it, the linking of security with development seems quite a positive move and quite a sensible move. But if you think back to last week when we looked at the implications of securitizing an issue, I want us to think a little bit about what some of the problems might be of this linking of development and security. And this is something in particular that I think you could be discussing in the forums. So the theory of human security claims to put all human beings as its referent object. So it's concerned with making all human beings, wherever they are geographically located, secure. But critical appraisals of human security argue that this isn't actually the case, that human security isn't concerned with all humans. Human security is concerned with humans in the global south. So one question that we can think about is, where does human security locate its threats? And if we look at some of the key issues that are on the human security agenda, such as drugs, disease, terrorism, pollution, poverty, environmental problems, or failed states, human security it locates those threats as coming from the global south, as coming from those states that are classed as underdeveloped, weak states, or failing states. So the argument goes that human security is portraying the global south as a threat to global security. This argument suggests that the human security discourse serves to enable and legitimise further intervention by Western states in the global south. So there are some really interesting post-colonial critiques of human security that I want you to take account of that suggest that the human security discourse serves to reinforce old colonial power relationships, that it helps to produce the idea of the civilized Western states and the savage other. So there's some nice quotes here that you could talk about in the forums. Embedded in this narrative is the belief that the savage peoples of the global south, a diverse block of peoples, cultures and societies, are a menace and a threat to global peace. Once the depiction of the savage other as an unruly horde is complete, the civilized self justifies its brutalization of the former as a heaven-ordained talk of pacification and civilization. So to conclude then, we have arguments that suggest on the one hand that human security is a paradigm shift, that it is a fundamental challenge to traditional security studies, that it rightly takes the focus of security studies away from the state and puts the human being at the centre of our concerns. So security studies becomes about those issues that make human beings insecure. And then on the other hand, we have arguments that suggest that human security simply reinforces realist security concerns, that it might provide a new language for them, a language that's more appropriate to the globalised era, but it doesn't fundamentally challenge the place of the state in security studies. I think this is a fascinating topic. There's a lot to unpack here, and I really look forward to seeing what you think in the forums.